There are moments when pride becomes the only thing keeping you upright, when you stand in front of what used to be yours and refuse to admit that everything is falling apart. For Thomas Mercer, that moment came every morning when he looked at the peeling paint on his farmhouse and pretended he couldn't see it. At 74 years old, with arthritis in both knees and a VA pension that barely covered his medications, Tom stood on 40 acres of Nebraska prairie that his grandfather had homesteaded in 1891. The land was his legacy, his identity, his last connection to a life that made sense. And the bank was taking it in 30 days. The foreclosure notice sat on his kitchen table, the words blurring together every time he tried to read them.
Thank you.
$60,000 in back taxes and loan payments. It might as well have been $1 million. His wife Margaret had been gone for 3 years now, and with her had gone his reason for maintaining the pretense that he was managing fine. His daughter lived in California with grandchildren he saw once a year if he was lucky. His son had died in Afghanistan in 2009, buried in Arlington with full honors that felt hollow when Tom visited the grave. Tom had served in Vietnam, came home in 1971 with a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer, and memories he kept buried deeper. He had built a life on this land, raised his children here, buried his wife in the small cemetery a mile down the road. The thought of leaving, of some developer buying the property and bulldozing the house Margaret had loved, of his family's history erased for strip malls or subdivisions, it made his chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with his heart condition. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late August when they arrived. Tom was in his barn trying to fix a fence post that had rotted through, sweat running down his face, despite the shade. The sound reached him first, a deep rumbling that grew louder until it filled the air, making the barn walls vibrate. He limped out into the sunlight, shading his eyes against the glare, and saw them coming down the county road. Motorcycles, dozens of them. Chrome gleaming in the prairie sun, engines growling like predatory animals, kicking up dust that hung in the hot air. They were moving slow, deliberately, and as they got closer, Tom could see the riders. Leather vests, bandanas, long hair whipping in the wind, faces hidden behind dark sunglasses. The lead bike bore a patch he recognized even from a distance, a skull with crossed pistons, the insignia of the Iron Reapers, a motorcycle club that had a reputation stretching across 3 states. Tom's hand moved instinctively to his hip, where he used to carry his service weapon. But that was 50 years ago, and all he had now was a bad knee and a worse attitude toward people who came onto his property uninvited. The motorcycles turned into his driveway, not just 1 or 2, but the entire pack, 20 bikes at least, filling his dirt drive with noise and chrome and the smell of hot metal and exhaust. They pulled up in a loose formation and killed their engines one by one until silence rushed back in, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. The lead rider dismounted first. He was massive, at least 6'4", and built like a barn door, with a gray beard that hung to his chest and arms covered in tattoos that disappeared under his leather vest. His face was weathered and scarred, the kind of face that had seen violence and dealt it back with interest. Behind him, the other riders dismounted, a collection of hard cases that looked like central casting for a movie about outlaw bikers. Men with prison tattoos and missing teeth, women with fierce eyes and leather chaps, all of them watching Tom with expressions that gave away nothing. Tom straightened his spine, ignoring the pain in his knees, and faced them with the same steady gaze he had used on Viet Cong and drill sergeants and everyone else who had ever tried to intimidate him. He might be old, he might be broke, he might be alone, but he was still Thomas Mercer, and he was standing on his own land. "This is private property," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Whatever you're selling or looking for, I'm not interested." The big man with the gray beard studied him for a long moment, then slowly reached up and removed his sunglasses. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless in the bright sun, and they swept over Tom's face, the barn behind him, the fields stretching away toward the horizon. "Thomas Mercer?" he asked, his voice a rumble that matched his engine. "That's right, who's asking?" "Name's Axel Gunderson. This is the Iron Reapers Midwest chapter." He gestured to the riders behind him. "We're not here to cause trouble, sir. We're actually looking for help." Tom felt a flicker of surprise but kept his expression neutral. "Help? What kind of help would a motorcycle club need from an old farmer? We've been riding for 6 hours straight. Got another 3 to go before we make Lincoln. It's hot as hell and we're about out of water. Saw your place from the road and thought we'd ask if you could spare some. We'll pay." Tom looked at them, 20 hard-looking strangers asking him for water like it was the most natural thing in the world. Every instinct told him to send them packing, that these were dangerous people who brought trouble wherever they went. But he looked at their faces again, really looked, and saw what he should have seen from the start. They were tired, road-worn, and despite the leather and the tattoos and the intimidating presence, they were just people who needed help. He thought about the foreclosure notice on his kitchen table, about the empty bank account and the medications he was skipping to save money, about the long, lonely evenings when the only sound was the wind through the prairie grass and his own breathing. He thought about Margaret, who had never turned away anyone who came to their door needing help, who had believed that kindness was not a weakness, but the only thing that made life worth living. "I don't want your money," Tom said, "but I've got a well that still pumps cold. You're welcome to fill your bottles. There's shade by the barn if you want to rest a while." Axel's expression shifted, something almost like respect crossing his weathered face. "That's kind of you, sir. We appreciate it." What followed was surreal. 20 bikers dismantled from their machines and moved through Tom's property with surprising courtesy, filling water bottles from his well, standing in the shade of his barn, speaking in low voices that didn't disturb the prairie quiet. Tom found himself offering more, bringing out a cooler of lemonade that Margaret used to make by the gallon for summer field workers, watching as these dangerous-looking strangers drank it gratefully and thanked him like he'd given them something precious. Axel ended up sitting on Tom's porch, drinking lemonade from a mason jar and looking out over the fields with an expression Tom recognized. The look of someone who understood what land meant, what roots meant, what it cost to belong somewhere. "Beautiful property," Axel said. "How long has it been in your family?" "Since 1891, my grandfather homesteaded it. Built the original house, though it burned down in 1923. My father rebuilt it. I've been here my whole life except for my service years." "Vietnam? How'd you know?" Axel gestured to the small flag hanging by the door, the one Margaret had insisted on flying every day. "The flag, and the way you stand. You've got that look. I did 2 tours in Iraq myself back when I was younger and dumber." Tom studied him with new eyes. "Marine?" "Army, 101st Airborne, got out in 2007, tried civilian life, hated it. The club became my new unit, I guess. Different mission, same brotherhood." They sat in companionable silence for a while, 2 old soldiers watching the sun move across the sky. Finally, Axel asked, "You doing okay out here, sir? Seems like a lot of land for one man to manage." Tom almost told him, almost confessed about the foreclosure, the debt, the loneliness, the slow erosion of everything he had built. But pride was a hard thing to swallow, and he'd been choking on it for 3 years. "I manage," he said instead. Axel didn't press, just nodded like he understood what wasn't being said. "Well, we should get back on the road. Thank you for the water and the hospitality. Not everyone would be kind to people like us. You needed help. That's enough reason." As the Iron Reapers mounted their bikes and started their engines, Axel paused beside Tom. If you ever need anything, sir, you let me know. He pulled a card from his vest and handed it over. I mean that. You showed us kindness when you didn't have to. That matters in my world. That's a debt. Tom watched them ride away, dust trailing behind them like a banner, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. He looked down at the card in his hand. Just a phone number and a name. He put it in his pocket and went back to his failing farm, never expecting to see them again. 3 days later, Tom collapsed in his kitchen. He had been feeling off all morning, a tightness in his chest that he attributed to stress and skipped breakfast. He was reaching for his blood pressure medication when the pain hit, a crushing weight that drove him to his knees and left him gasping on the linoleum floor Margaret had picked out 20 years ago. His phone was on the counter, impossibly far away. His vision was graying at the edges, and in a moment of desperation, his hand found his pocket and pulled out the card Axel had given him. He managed to dial the number, managed to gasp out his name and address before the phone fell from his hand, and darkness rushed in. Tom woke in a hospital room, sunlight streaming through blinds, the beep of monitors steady and reassuring. His chest hurt, and there were tubes in his arms, but he was alive. A nurse came in when she saw him stirring, checked his vitals with practiced efficiency. Welcome back, Mr. Mercer. You had a heart attack. Quite a serious one. You're lucky your friend called 911 so quickly. Friend? The man who was with you, big guy? Looked like he rode a motorcycle? He's been in the waiting room since they brought you in yesterday. Won't leave until he knows you're okay. Axel? Tom closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that a stranger had saved his life, had somehow gotten to his farm and called for help when Tom had been sure he was going to die alone on his kitchen floor. When Axel was finally allowed into the room, he looked exhausted, still wearing his leather vest, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Don't ever scare me like that again, old man, he said, but his voice was gentle. When you called, you sounded like you were dying. I was dying. How did you get there so fast? I was passing through Council Bluffs when you called. Wasn't that far? I broke about 15 traffic laws getting to your place and met the ambulance there. Axel pulled up a chair and sat heavily. The doctors say you're going to be okay, but you need surgery, bypass, they think, and you can't go home alone after that. You need someone to help you recover. Tom felt everything crushing down on him at once. The medical bills he couldn't afford, the surgery he needed, the farm he was losing, the daughter who lived too far away to help, the son who was dead and buried, the wife who had been his partner and was gone. It was too much. He was too tired. He couldn't fight anymore. I don't have anyone, he said, and his voice broke on the words. My wife is dead. My son is dead. My daughter has her own life. I'm losing my farm. I can't afford the surgery. I can't afford anything. I'm done, Axel. I'm just done. Axel was quiet for a long moment, then leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. Tell me about the farm. Tell me everything. So Tom did. He told him about the foreclosure notice, the $60,000 he couldn't pay, the developer who had already made an offer to the bank, the legacy being erased because he couldn't work like he used to and his pension wasn't enough. He told him about Margaret and his son and the loneliness that was worse than any physical pain. He told him everything because he had nothing left to lose and no reason to pretend anymore. When he finished, Axel stood up. I need to make some calls. You rest. And Mr. Mercer, don't give up yet. You showed me and my brothers kindness when we needed it. Now it's our turn. Tom didn't understand what he meant until 4 days later when he was released from the hospital with instructions for surgery the following week and stern warnings about stress and overexertion. A social worker had arranged for temporary home care, but Tom barely heard the details. He was focused on the fact that when he got home, He'd have to look at that foreclosure notice again and figure out where to go when they took his land. But when the ride service dropped him off at his farm, he found that something had changed. The driveway was full of motorcycles. Not just 20 this time, but what looked like 100 or more. Bikes parked in neat rows that extended down the county road. The farmyard was full of people, dozens of them, men and women in leather vests with the Iron Reaper's patch, but also others, civilians in work clothes, all of them moving with purpose around his property. Tom got out of the car slowly, his chest still sore from the heart attack, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The barn that had been listing to one side was now straight, new boards bright against the old. The fence that had been falling down was rebuilt. The porch that had been sagging was reinforced. The house had fresh paint. Axel emerged from the crowd, grinning behind his gray beard. "Welcome home, sir. We've been busy." "What is this? What's happening?" "This," Axel gestured to the activity around them, "is what happens when you help the Iron Reapers." Word went out to every chapter between here and Denver, then to their friends, then to their families. Turns out a lot of people wanted to help the old veteran who showed kindness to strangers. A woman approached, maybe 50 years old, with kind eyes and an Iron Reaper's patch on her vest. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Sarah Gunderson, Axel's wife. We've been coordinating the work. Your barn is repaired, the house is painted, we've fixed the plumbing issues you had, and replaced the roof that was leaking. We've also weeded your fields and harvested what was ready. Everything's being stored in your barn." Tom couldn't speak. He looked around at all these people, these strangers, who had come to help him, who were working on his property, like it mattered to them. "I can't pay you for this," he managed to say. "I don't have money for—" "We don't want money," Axel interrupted. "You gave us water when we needed it. You gave us shade and kindness. You treated us like human beings instead of criminals. That's worth more than money to people like us, sir. That's worth showing up for." Another man stepped forward, older, with white hair and a gentle face. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Frank Patterson. I served in Vietnam too, 1st Air Cavalry. When Axel put the word out about your situation, about a fellow veteran losing his land, well, we couldn't let that happen. Not on our watch. I don't understand. The Iron Reapers, we're not just a motorcycle club," Axel explained. "Most of us are veterans. We ride together because we understand each other, because civilian life doesn't always make sense after service. We take care of our own. And you became one of our own when you showed us kindness." Sarah handed him an envelope. "This is from all of us. Every chapter contributed. We did fundraisers, asked our communities, reached out to veteran organizations we're connected to. It's enough to pay off your back taxes and the loan payments. The bank has been contacted. The foreclosure is being withdrawn. This farm stays yours, Mr. Mercer. It stays in your family where it belongs." Tom's hands shook as he opened the envelope and saw the check inside. $65,000, more than enough to save his land. He looked up at all the faces watching him, strangers who had become something else, people who had answered a call because another veteran needed help. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you do all this for me?" Frank Patterson stepped closer, and Tom saw that his eyes were wet. "Because you reminded us of our fathers, our grandfathers, the men who came home from war and built lives with their hands and their hearts, the men who taught us what honor meant, what duty meant, what home meant. You're one of those men, sir, and men like you don't lose their land if we can help it. Not to banks, not to developers, not to anyone." Tom felt tears running down his face, years of held-back grief and loneliness and fear coming out all at once. Axel stepped forward and pulled him into a careful hug, mindful of his recovering heart, and Tom found himself surrounded by people, by support, by something he hadn't felt in 3 years. A community, a family, brothers and sisters in arms, who understood what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to come home, and try to build something worth protecting. Over the following weeks, as Tom recovered from his surgery, the Iron Reapers and their extended network continued to help. They arranged for a rotation of people to stay with him during recovery, making sure he took his medications, helping with physical therapy, cooking meals he actually ate instead of the sad frozen dinners he'd been surviving on. They brought their children and grandchildren to meet him, kids who called him Mr. Tom, and played in his fields like Tom's own grandchildren had once done. His daughter flew in from California, shocked by what she found. Not the deteriorating farm and failing father she'd expected, but a property that looked better than it had in years, and a dad who was surrounded by more people than she'd seen at her mother's funeral. "Dad," she said, standing in the renovated kitchen and looking around in wonder. "How did this happen?" Tom told her the story about the bikers asking for water, about the heart attack, about Axel and the Iron Reapers and the army of people who had shown up to save his legacy. He told her about finding family in the most unexpected place, about learning that kindness given freely could come back multiplied beyond imagining. "I gave them water," he said, still amazed by it all. "That's all I did. I gave them water." "No, Dad," his daughter said, tears in her eyes. "You gave them respect. You gave them kindness. You treated them like human beings when probably a lot of people had treated them like threats. That matters. That changes things." The Iron Reapers hosted their annual rally at Tom's farm that September. 300 bikes descended on the prairie, turning his fields into a temporary city of leather and chrome and brotherhood. They asked permission first, offered to pay, but Tom refused payment. Instead, he opened his land to them, provided what little he could, and found himself embraced by a culture he'd never understood before. He learned that the Iron Reapers weren't criminals, though some had rough pasts. They were veterans mostly, men and women who had served their country and came home to a civilian world that didn't understand them. They were fathers and mothers, workers and business owners, people who had found community and purpose in riding together, in taking care of each other, in showing up when someone needed help. Axel's wife Sarah told him stories while they sat on his rebuilt porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold and red. She told him about members who had been saved from suicide by the club, who had found reasons to live when they came home from war without hope. She told him about their charity work, the veteran support groups they ran, the families they helped when soldiers were deployed. "You see people like us, and you see the leather and the bikes, and you think, danger," she said. "But most of us, we're just looking for the same things everyone wants: purpose, community, family, a reason to keep going. You understood that without us having to explain it. That's rare, Mr. Mercer. That's precious." On the last night of the rally, they held a ceremony. Tom was brought forward in front of hundreds of bikers, all of them standing at attention like soldiers on parade. Axel presented him with a leather vest, the Iron Reaper's patch prominent on the back, but with additional patches that made Tom's throat tight. Honorary member, Vietnam veteran, brother. "Thomas Mercer," Axel said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "You showed us kindness when we needed it. You reminded us what we're supposed to stand for: honor, loyalty, taking care of our own. You're one of us now. You're family, and we take care of family." The bikers erupted in cheers, engines revving in salute, and Tom stood there wearing his new vest, surrounded by more family than he'd had in years, and understood that sometimes the most dangerous-looking strangers are actually angels who ride motorcycles. That winter, when Nebraska turned cold and the prairie wind howled, Tom wasn't alone. Members of the Iron Reapers checked on him regularly, helped with snow removal, made sure he had groceries and company. His daughter visited more often, bringing her children, and finding that her father had an entire community looking after him. Frank Patterson became a regular visitor, two old Vietnam veterans sharing stories, and silence in equal measure. Sarah Gunderson brought meals and conversation and adopted Tom as the father figure she'd lost years ago. Axel showed up unannounced to fix things that broke, or just to sit on the porch and watch the sunset. On the anniversary of the day Tom had given the Iron Reapers water, Axel showed up with a gift. It was a plaque, beautifully made with words burned into the wood. In a world where you can be anything, be kind. Kindness returned multiplied. The Iron Reapers, in gratitude to Thomas Mercer, who taught us that the smallest axe can save everything that matters. Tom hung it above his fireplace, where Margaret's picture sat, where his son's medals were displayed, where his family history lived. He looked at it every day and remembered that sometimes salvation comes on motorcycles, wearing leather, looking dangerous, but carrying the kind of love that moves mountains and saves farms and reminds old men that they're not alone. He learned that danger is in the eye of the beholder, that the people society fears are often the ones who show up when you're dying on your kitchen floor, that a cup of water given freely can save more than a man's life. It can save his legacy, his land, his reason to keep living. Tom Mercer died peacefully 4 years later at 78 in his own bed in the farmhouse his grandfather had built. He was surrounded by family, his daughter, his grandchildren, and 40 members of the Iron Reapers who stood vigil during his final days, making sure he knew he was loved, that he mattered, that he had made a difference. They buried him next to Margaret in the small cemetery down the road. 300 motorcycles formed the funeral procession, engines rumbling like thunder across the prairie. Veterans from 3 wars stood at attention. The folded flag was presented to his daughter with full military honors. And the farm, the 40 acres that had almost been lost, stayed in the family. Tom had arranged for it to be placed in a trust, managed by his daughter but available for Iron Reapers rallies every year. A gathering place for veterans who needed community, who needed to remember that they weren't alone, who needed to know that kindness matters. Above the barn door, Axel installed another plaque, one that would remain as long as the building stood. On this land, Thomas Mercer taught us that how you treat strangers defines who you are. Here we remember that lesson. Here we gather as family. Here we honor the man who saw beyond appearances to the humanity underneath. Here we remember that the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. And every August, when the Iron Reapers return to the Mercer farm for their rally, they make a pilgrimage to Tom's grave. They stand in silence, these dangerous-looking strangers, with their leather and their tattoos and their rumbling engines, and they remember the old farmer who gave them water on a hot day and received back far more than he could have imagined. They remember that kindness is never wasted, that small acts matter, that the people you fear might be exactly the family you need, and that sometimes the last stand you make isn't alone in a dying farmhouse, but surrounded by brothers and sisters who showed up when it mattered most. The prairie grass grows tall around the cemetery now, waving in the constant wind, and if you listen carefully on August nights, you can hear the distant rumble of engines, the sound of family coming home, the echo of a debt repaid, and a kindness that multiplied beyond measure. Because Thomas Mercer gave water to dangerous strangers, and they gave him back everything that matters: community, purpose, family, and the assurance that his legacy would endure long after he was gone. That's what happens when you see people instead of appearances, when you offer help instead of judgment, when you remember that everyone, even dangerous-looking strangers on motorcycles, is just looking for the same things: respect, kindness, and proof that they matter. Tom Mercer found that truth on a hot August day when he said yes to a request for water. And in return, he found salvation, family, and a second chance at the life he thought was ending. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is be kind to strangers. And sometimes that danger is exactly what saves you.